So today we're going to be talking about things that I've learned as a new engineering manager. And while I've learned a ton of stuff since starting this role, I've narrowed it down to 5 key takeaways that I'll share today. But first, let me introduce myself. So I'm Zach. I started coding at age 9, and that fascination with computers has kind of driven my career as a software engineer. That kind of fueled my drive to become a software engineer, and so for the majority of my professional career, that's what I did. I worked in telecommunications, fintech, edtech, up until about 2 years ago when I took the leap into people management. Actually, as it happened, when I made that transition, I was managing the same team that I was a contributor on, which posed some very interesting challenges and growth opportunities for me. These days, I am an engineering manager at a healthcare startup working with a team of 12 entry-level contributors, which is super exciting and super challenging at the same time. In preparation for this talk, I asked coworkers and friends to send me pictures and captions of how they would introduce me to a conference audience, and this is what they said. They said that I'm super hardworking and that I'm always in the office extending our products and helping our software engineers grow. But when I'm not in the office, I'm traveling the world, building a professional image and expanding my network. Here you see me networking with a random police officer in Cluj, Romania, and then on the right over there on the same evening, hanging out with a construction worker. I believe they were building a crosswalk there when we stumbled across them and forced them into a selfie. To be fair, there were probably a few drinks that night. But I'm not always focused on work. I also like to take time to unwind and stay active. And you can always find me on the basketball court doing sports. So you can see me flexing my skills there. Go sports. So today we're going to be talking about those 5 key takeaways, lessons that I've learned as I transitioned my career into a management role. And we're going to talk about how those lessons can be applied to any role. So what we're going to talk about today is from the perspective of me as an engineering manager, but you do not have to be a manager or any type of level to get the same value from this conversation. But before we jump into the lessons, there's a couple things I want to cover. So if you haven't noticed yet, this is a very informal presentation. All of my talks and all of my conferences are super informal. More importantly, leadership and management are 2 very different things. So while a lot of the points that I'm talking about are from the perspective of my experience as a manager, they're going to cross into leadership principles and ideas that we have as well. So I just want to be clear that leadership comes from any level of the organization. It doesn't matter what your role is or what you do, and management is just a title that allows us to focus on growth. So those are 2 very different things. Also, this is going to be an interactive presentation, so I'm going to need some help here, and I need you to be super energetic. The way this is going to work is before we transition into each topic, you're going to see a slide with a statistic that relates to whatever we're talking about next. So when this slide happens, I'll read the question, and then I need you to just shout out whatever you think the answer is. So in this case, what percentage of employees avoid tough conversations? 70%. So this is a great group. Yes, 70%, which is crazy, but so believable because tough conversations are very important growth tools for us as humans and as software engineers and as whatever it is that we do for our lives. But it's one of the things that we as humans also hate so much are these tough conversations. And that brings me directly to the first incredibly important lesson I learned after I became a manager. You can't avoid tough conversations no matter how hard you try. So if I'm standing awkward, by the way, it's because I can't really move, and normally I walk around, so I apologize. But so after I first took over my team, and remember, I was a contributor on the same team that I'm now a manager on. So things that weren't necessarily my responsibility before became my focus as the manager of the team. We had an engineer. We'll call him Michael. Very smart guy. He was very technically capable. He knew the technology inside and out, knew the internals of the language. He was the guy you would go ask for technical help. But the way he communicated was not super productive or helpful, and it left a lot of friction between him and the other teammates and the other people that he communicated with. It wasn't malicious intent, it just didn't come across in a helpful or supportive way. And so there it is, my first tough conversation that I have to have. I know that this is important because this type of communication, well, one, the soft skills for Michael will become way more important as he grows in his career to senior levels of engineering where soft skills become arguably more important than hard technical skills. But also the team dynamic and the morale of the team are kind of at stake here if they're not able to get along, if they're not able to communicate effectively and productively. So I know I have to have this conversation, but I don't want to. I know it's my responsibility now, and it's something that's important that I have to do, but it's also a conversation that I would personally prefer to avoid. But that's incredibly damaging and incredibly dangerous. Tough conversations are, like I said, our tool for growth. Yeah, they might suck in the moment when you're having them, or you might get stressed out leading up to them. But they should always have an outcome that leads to growth for everybody involved, right? Tough conversations in this case, helps me grow as a manager to learn how to have these conversations in a productive, non-damaging way. And it also helps Michael grow as a software engineer and as a general communicator because we'll be able to identify the problem and come up with a plan to correct it. So tough conversations are incredibly important, but that's not the only part of it, right? So when you have these tough conversations, what's included in them? That was my next thought, right? By the way, I'm like 2 weeks into this new role in my very first management role when I'm going through this. So I know that I know some stuff, but I know like next to nothing. And while was a confident but humble software engineer, I was not a confident manager at the time. But so I know that I have to have this conversation with Michael. I'm just not quite sure what should be included in it. So, feedback. How many managers do you think, according to this Harris Poll survey, are uncomfortable providing feedback to their reports? So it is 37%. Man, I'm glad it's not 78%. 30, but that's still, I mean, if we're talking about globally, 37% is still a lot. Granted, not every single person in the world participated in this study, but that's still a large portion of managers that are uncomfortable providing feedback to their people, especially when it is what a lot of people would say a negative or a negative topic, but I'd like to call that a growth opportunity. So that brings me to my next lesson. It is incredibly important or critical that when you are providing feedback, it is constructive and it encourages growth. Those are the outcomes we want with feedback. I was working for a telecommunication company, and I worked there for roughly a year as a tech lead, and we launched a large number of products into production. But I was there for roughly a year, and I received feedback once. The feedback was that I walk too fast and that I sweat when I come from outside. Remember, we're in Phoenix, right? It's 115 degrees, so it's hot. That was my feedback. And instead of encouraging growth, I was like, well, what the hell? That is not helpful. I don't know that I can do anything in this company. So feedback has to be clear, it has to be actionable, and it has to provide a path forward for everybody involved. So going back to the conversation with Michael, I already have this tough conversation that I have to have with him. And now I know that feedback is going to be, well, I already knew that feedback was going to be the center of that conversation. But what does that feedback look like? You know, I can't just tell Michael, your communication sucks, do better. That doesn't help. That doesn't tell him how or what to do. That doesn't tell him how to do it. And it doesn't provide a path forward, which is super crappy. So when we're talking about feedback, You know, a lot of people, I've had several bosses myself, where feedback was a prescriptive, you're doing bad, I'm giving you this feedback and that's it. But that doesn't help. That doesn't do anything other than piss me off and make me not know what I'm supposed to do next. So when approaching this conversation with Michael, I knew that I needed to be clear because we do have a communication issue that we do have to resolve. But I also knew that it needed to be constructive, so not nitpicky type stuff like walking too fast, things that are actually impactful and will improve the interaction between him and his teammates and the rest of the organization. And I knew that the outcome needed to be growth-centered, because that is ultimately what we're after, is growth for ourselves, for our teams, for our products, for our companies. So, how many professionals said that they are uncomfortable or flat out refuse to ask for help when they need it? 73%. And that is a crazy number, but that was me. Okay, so I didn't refuse to ask for help, but my fear was that if I didn't, new in this role, if I didn't know how to approach people's stuff, how can I be a people manager? That was my concern. I'd be viewed as unfit or unready for that role. And that is this next lesson. You will always need help, regardless of how great you think you are. And the important part is there are always people around you that can help you and that are willing to help you. It wasn't until I was in a one-on-one with a coworker, and she was an amazing engineering manager. She was managing a team at the company at the time, and we were talking about what I needed to be successful in my role, the type of support I needed, what was going on with the transition, managing the team that I worked with, things of that nature. And I mentioned to her that this very thing, I feel like if I don't know at least the super high level or mid-level basics of this particular role, how to interact with these conversations and manage and help grow people, that I fear that the view of me would be that I wasn't ready for this role or that I was not good for this role. My three biggest fears when accepting this transition was breaking people, breaking teams, and breaking products. And I didn't want to do any of those. So I knew I needed to be productive and impactful in what I was doing. But as I was telling her this, her name is Grace, as I was telling her this, she just looks at me directly and says, "Zach, that's dumb. That doesn't make sense. That's a very unrealistic expectation. Nobody knows everything about anything. We work in teams because people have different experiences. They have different perspectives, different opinions, and we take all of those together to form the most ideal path forward." That's how it was when I was a contributor, so why was I not looking at this new role in the same way? It doesn't matter what we're doing, it's the same concept. There's a whole team of other managers and management level staff in the company that have done this exact same thing that I need to do with Michael probably millions of times. Why not pool that logic and have a productive, impactful conversation? So after our one-on-one, I realized, I knew I didn't know everything, but now I realize that everybody is there to help you, and you have to take advantage of that. But it's your responsibility to take advantage of that as well. So now I know that I have to have this conversation with Michael. I know it needs to include super clear and useful feedback, and I know that I have help to do it now. So we talked about the specifics of the challenges that Michael was having with the way he communicated and potential ways to address that and move forward. So those things are great for a conversation like this, but there's one key component that kind of brings everything together, and that component is trust. You have to have trust to have these candid conversations with your direct reports, with your bosses, with your coworkers, in order to reflect on yourselves and your team. Which brings us to our next one. What percentage of employees say they would be more comfortable trusting a stranger or being more vulnerable with a complete stranger than their boss or their direct superior? 58, according to this Harvard Business study. 58 is still crazy, though. That's over half over half of employees are more willing to be vulnerable with a complete stranger than their direct supervisor, which is crazy because as a people manager, our goal is growth for our people. That is our focus. That's what we do. Some companies require you to be super technical. Some companies don't. But the focus of our job is growth. So if we don't have that trust, how can we have conversations like what I have to have with Michael and help him understand that his communication is not productive and we need a path forward? You have to have trust for that. And that brings us to our next lesson. It's imperative that you spend time building that trust, right? I said earlier that management is a title, which means anybody that a hiring leader, or usually a director if you're hiring a manager, but anybody that a hiring leader decides can be a manager can have that title. So there's no inherent trust with that. You don't know who you're working with. You don't know who this new manager is. And while I spent a lot of time building trust as a contributor on this team, it's a different type of trust. When I became the manager of the team, the dynamic changed drastically. So we had to not rebuild, but we had to adjust what that trust looked like and what that covered. And so Michael and I had previously spent time building trust through various team builder exercises, open communication, things of that nature. And so we had a level of trust that allowed us to have this very candid and clear conversation about what the problem was. Because we need to ensure that when we're saying something, that we have trust that the person receiving it will receive it in a productive, impactful way. But they also have to have trust that what you're saying or the feedback you're providing is coming from a good place. It's coming from a place of growth and a place of success for everybody involved, which is what a lot of conversations, unfortunately, in my experience, have been missing. Just because a leader or a manager comes in and has a manager title doesn't automatically mean that everybody is aligned, and also doesn't mean that you should just prescribe things, right? It's all collaborative based. So you have to spend time building trust. Otherwise, you can't have these conversations, and you can't make forward progress in the areas that you need to. It also reduces stress. So what percentage of employees say they have a high level of anxiety when at work or thinking about work? So I was very confident that it was 99% as well, but it's only 43. And the only reason I can think of that is because they asked the wrong people who are not day-to-day real-world people, right? But even looking at that number, 43% of people say that they have an increased level of anxiety or stress when thinking about work or thinking about their day-to-day. That sucks because work, while it will be stressful, it doesn't need to be so stressful that you have an increased level of anxiety thinking about it. And when you dig into that study, I changed the slide too soon, oh well, but when you dig into that study, you realize that a lot of that anxiety comes from lack of expectations. Employees don't know what is expected of them. They don't know what to expect of their bosses, of their coworkers, and that creates a lot of stress or a lot of anxiety in the day-to-day of the employee. So it's incredibly important that you be extremely clear about expectations. Whether you're talking about what you expect from your coworkers or from other teams or from your boss, or your boss is talking about what they expect from you, all of those expectations should be incredibly clear. The first thing I did when I took over my team was schedule one-on-ones, of course, we do those weekly, but talk about what those expectations were. Yes, I am the manager of the team now. This is kind of what I expect from the employees, and I'm not talking about on a super granular level, right? I'm not talking about a checklist that they complete when they come into work, log in, commit code, go to lunch, come back from lunch. I don't care about that stuff. We're talking about high enough level to where they have space to do their job in the way they need to, but are aligned with kind of what's expected. So we talked about like participation in company committees, like the DEI committees and things like that. We talked about mentoring and coaching other engineers on the team and in the organization. But one of the most important parts of this particular conversation was we talked about what their expectations of me were as well. You know, expectations, just like trust, kind of go two ways. I can have expectations for my people, and that can help them align to what it is that I'm expecting to get out of the relationship. But they also have expectations for me. And if I'm aligned or understand what those expectations are, then we can align together and work most impactfully and productively in whatever it is that we're trying to do, if it's a product engineering team in this case. So expectations have to be clear because hopefully we'll get that 43% down with clear expectations. But they help us understand exactly what the path forward is and what we're supposed to do in our day-to-day. Now, one thing that's super important to point out here is that this is not a recipe for micromanagement. Setting expectations is important, but nobody likes to be micromanaged. I don't like to micromanage, and that creates a dynamic that's not positive or impactful. You know, this is, like I said, we have to create the space for people to do their job in the way they need to do their job. If they use a different keyboard, who cares? If they use a different IDE, who cares, right? We have to align and understand what everybody expects of each other, but give each other the space to do whatever our jobs actually are. So clear expectations, yes. Micromanagement, no. And so if we take, I don't know how I am on time. I think I'm actually going way faster than I planned. So if we take all of the lessons that we've talked about today, you know, not avoiding tough conversations, providing constructive, clear, actionable feedback, recognizing that you're always going to need help and accepting that help from others, spending time to build trust with your teammates, with your bosses, your coworkers, everybody that you work with, and being clear about expectations. If you combine all of these, it's not going to make a perfect manager. It's not going to make a perfect contributor. But what it will do is set that tone for success and productivity, is set that tone for collaboration, and foster a culture that appreciates open communication, candid communication, and trust between their employees. It fosters a culture of collaboration and growth. And ultimately, that's what we're looking for in our teams. We have to keep, even if you're talking about it from a CEO level or a director of product level, the engagement and success and growth of your teams is one of the most important things that you can ever focus on. And I'm not just saying that because that's my job and I want to keep my job. It really is important. And that manifests in the way you interact, the way you're able to freely speak and iterate on yourselves, on your team, on your processes. And that's how we create teams that move forward successfully. Yeah, so that is all I have today. Thank you for listening. You can always reach out to me for questions, comments, feedback. This is also an opportunity of growth for me. This is my first talk that's not super technical. So any feedback will help me as well. Thank you.